Hello and welcome to Out of India Theory. Hope you guys are doing well. In today's video, I wanted to talk a little bit about the ideas that influenced me, or rather inspired me to look into anti-gravity research and alternate propulsion systems and all these associated ideas a long time ago. But I feel some of them were really crucial in shaping my ideas and pointing me in the right direction to look for answers in these areas. So the first one is this book called Something Called Nothing. It's a very strange, sort of very unimaginative title, but understandable because it's a translation from Russian. The book was originally written somewhere in the 1980s and published by Mir Publishers, and the author is certain Podolny. So this book has nothing to do with anti-gravity as such or gravity as such, but this was the first time that I got introduced to the idea that physical vacuum is not actually empty. And most people think, even today, that vacuum means emptiness. So first of all, it's impossible to have 100% physical vacuum. You just simply cannot, like if you consider like an enclosed space, you simply cannot get rid of every single last molecule of gas that's in that enclosed space. It's just practically impossible. But assuming you are able to have a complete 100% physical vacuum, even then, this book revealed that vacuum, that space is not empty, because it is filled, empty space is filled with these low-level quantum fluctuations that it called zero-point oscillations. And this for me was a completely new and mind-boggling idea, the idea of zero-point oscillations and zero-point energy. And the fact that it sort of dawned on me after that, and reading other research from other people, that something like that could potentially be tapped as a source of energy, so zero-point energy itself is a very legitimate concept that is accepted in science right now, but then tapping zero-point energy for other uses is still considered fringe and not really, at least publicly, accepted as possible. Anyway, so I was introduced to the concept of zero-point oscillations through this book, and also it explained how can oscillations and fluctuations in fields be created spontaneously out of nothing if there is no matter or particles. And that's where they introduced this concept of virtual particles. So virtual particles are particles which spontaneously appear and disappear really, really quickly in vacuum. Now, seemingly, this is a violation of the law of conservation of energy, because the law of conservation of energy says that matter cannot be created, nor can it be destroyed, and you certainly cannot create something out of nothing. But that's exactly what seems to be happening. Virtual particles seem to spontaneously arise and disappear into nothing. And does this violate the law of conservation of energy? So the way the book explained this, which I found beautiful, is like you're a cashier at a bank and you're swindling money from the bank, but you replace the money before somebody finds out, right? So it all happens on a time scale that is so short that it falls outside the purview of law of conservation of energy. So these virtual particles appear and disappear so quickly, their lifetime is so short. I think it's in the order of 10 power minus 24 seconds, if I remember correctly, or even lesser, that it simply falls outside or below the threshold of detection of this overarching law. And from this, so this doesn't have a direct connection to gravity or gravity shielding as such, but the fact that this energy could be tapped to power devices that can travel through space was an idea that I came to understand at some point. And also, it introduced this idea of the Casimir effect. Now, if you haven't heard of the Casimir effect, so basically, if you take two perfectly parallel plates or mirrors and hold them really close, and when I say close, I mean nanometer distance apart in this vacuum enclosure, because of this bubbling and fluctuating field, this invisible sea, that exerts a very real pressure from the outside onto these plates. So they experience an attractive force. They are pushed towards each other. So the Casimir effect is basically a very weak but a very real and measurable attractive force that brings two closely held plates together in vacuum. Now, why is this important? Because some people say that given the quantum nature of gravity, there could be a similar gravitational Casimir effect, or somehow the Casimir effect itself, if you could figure out how to make it work on a larger scale, because it's not just attractive, because under some conditions it can also be repulsive. So that's one source, the book, something called Nothing, Physical Vacuum. What is the nature of physical vacuum? And this is somewhere written in the 80s, so the science is definitely outdated at this point, I'm guessing. But I highly recommend that you check this book. I'll put a link in the description below. I think there's a free version of the book available on the internet. Now, on to the second influence for me was the work of Thomas Townsend Brown and the Byfield-Brown effect and the whole wide area of electrogravitics. Now, this came to me via another book called The Philadelphia Experiment, which I wouldn't go into right now because it's completely off topic. But then, so the Philadelphia Experiment, the book introduced Thomas Townsend Brown to me in one of its chapters, and then later on, of course, I read more about his work. And I'm not going to go into too much of detail because I've done a separate exclusive video, like a 1 hour long podcast exploring the life and work of Thomas Townsend Brown. You can check out the podcast that's with the biographer of Thomas Townsend Brown, Paul Schtazkin, and it's a really, really fascinating talk. I highly recommend that podcast. So electrogravitics and the fact that you can create devices which demonstrate this force that can potentially act against gravity was another new concept to me.
I'm getting closer to being able to accept the proposition that yes, there is something very real and viable in the work that Townsend Brown did, and that continues to be developed in a realm so dark that, like a black hole, light can't even escape from it.
Do you think Townsend Brown mastered gravity?
I actually do, yeah.
So that's a field that I feel has not really been tapped by mainstream science and universities and researchers across the world. Last of the main influence that really got me involved in this was this article that I read in 2002 in the magazine New Scientist on the work done by a very obscure Russian ceramic engineer called Yevgeny Podkletnov. He seemed to have discovered a gravity shielding effect by spinning superconductors. According to this article, what exactly was done was that you basically take a superconducting disk of specific dimensions, and you levitate it with a magnetic field. You cool it below minus 233 degrees Celsius, and then you levitate it with a magnetic field. And then there are coils surrounding the disk to which you apply alternating current of approximately 100 kilohertz. and cause the disk to rotate. And when the disk rotates, well, when it reaches speeds of more than 5,000 RPM, anything that is held on top of that disk started losing weight. Now, it's pretty remarkable because, so weight, of course, is a force with which an object is pulled towards Earth, right? So it's mass multiplied by the acceleration due to gravity. So the only thing that could be happening here, given the invariability of the acceleration due to gravity under these conditions, is that the mass seems to be somehow reducing, and this was a reversible effect. And the loss of weight was very small, a very small percentage, and it was measurable with using a very highly sensitive measuring, like a weight measuring instrument. But it was very promising, and the fact that you could lose weight just by putting something on top of a spinning superconductor was something fascinating. He held that other people saw and tried and agreed with his results. So his research was, so this article that I read was published in 2002, but his research was already a decade old by then, because I think his first paper on the topic was published in 1992. And the superconductor that he used was the YBCO, or the yttrium barium copper oxide family of superconductors. Now, the yttrium barium copper oxide superconductor family is actually quite a very well known type of superconductor. But somehow, when other people tried to reproduce, they either did not, they were unable to reproduce the same effects, or the effects were so minuscule that it could be put down to instrument error, and yet he maintained in private that his effects were real. And in fact, the author of this article, David Cohen, apparently reached out to this obscure, I don't know who this is. This is a Japanese senior professor who called Takashi Nakamura, who seemingly worked for this for Toshiba Electronics, who was also able to reproduce this. And apparently he was in communication with this person whose identity is not exactly confirmed. And the Japanese professor wrote back to him saying, yes, it is real, and his own results were even more spectacular, and he was able to achieve like an 8-point something percentage of weight loss using his superconductor. So the question is, what gives? Why isn't this so widely tested, and why are other people not able to reproduce? The problem seems to be that the exact composition, the exact recipe that went into making this superconductor is a closely held secret, and Dr. Podkletnov doesn't really want to reveal it. And apparently somebody at NASA was convinced there's something here, that at some point about $600,000 were spent on building a device that would reproduce this result. At some point, I remember reading there was this project that Boeing was funding or wanted to fund called GRASP. And at some point, I think they were trying to emulate something similar, a propellant-less propulsion system that was based on a spinning superconductor. But Boeing simply denied ever funding this, and they said they don't really comment on their black projects, which is kind of strange, which seems to be acknowledging that they do have a black project. And so basically there it stands. And I spoke to Nick Cook, a former editor of the defense journal Jane's Defense Weekly, and also the author of the amazing book called The Hunt for Zero Point, which I highly recommend also. But he was of the opinion that, at least according to his research, there was nothing here, and he wasn't convinced that anything really came out of Podkletnov's work, and that's where it stands.
You probably know that NASA picked up some of Podkletnov's work, and they tried to replicate it, and they couldn't replicate it.
Right.
And Podkletnov said that was because they did not have the secret source for his ceramic superconductors.
Right,
those
right.
that's why.
Right.
I struggle with the whole Podkletnov story because he's never produced any evidence that of his claims, which is that you get these weight reductions in the weight of objects above the superconductors, and then he developed a secondary version, he said, which was produced a repulsive force, so that you injected a current into the gravitational beam, and you had a weapon.
Right.
So, like, prove it. Well, he never did, to the best of my knowledge.
So that's where it is. So these are the three main influences that I wanted to talk about. But I'm really convinced that somebody, and this was remembered decades ago, and given that material science is advanced by leaps and bounds, and our knowledge of physics and gravitation and the theoretical underpinnings of quantum gravity seem to have grown since, I'm pretty sure that someone somewhere has managed to crack this and achieved far greater results in gravity shielding. Why am I mentioning all this? Because I look at launches and space endeavors and all these startups, especially here in India. A lot of these small private startups coming up, which are creating their own rockets and satellites and experiments that are pushed into space. And I'm a little bugged that everybody seems to be still sticking to this age-old, brutish and primitive propulsion system that is still based on Newton's third law, which is, in my opinion, still incredibly inefficient. Such a massive wastage of energy, completely unsustainable, not very economical, because at some point we're going to run out of fossil fuels, and completely not useful for long. If you're really thinking of humanity like really heading out into space and reaching the far reaches of the solar system or even go beyond, this kind of propulsion, I think, is not going to take us very far. And even if you consider replacing with nuclear fuel, which is a huge red flag and a risk, I don't think this is really sustainable at all. And to me, the biggest problem with this kind of propulsion that is still relying on Newton's third law is that it betrays a lack of understanding on humanity's part of one of the most fundamental, one of the most basic laws and forces of nature, which is gravitation. And we still don't know anything about it. Or we do know a lot about gravity, but we still don't know some of the most basic things about the nature of gravity. And I feel like our propulsion systems must be much more elegant, much more efficient, much more powerful, in that it works with gravity and sort of exploits something in its nature and utilizes it to take us far, because this will help us understand the nature of the cosmos itself. And I feel like we are not really investing, at least here in India, in basic research. We're not really investing money or time or energy that I know of into gravity research. And there is a huge vacuum here. I think people should, one, spend more time and energy into gravity research and research into alternate propulsion systems that are simply, let me say, propellant-less propulsion systems. I think one of the main reasons seems to be that there is no hope. So most of these things that I spoke about tends to fall into a fringe sort of conspiracy theory kind of gray area, which most mainstream scientists don't want to touch with a pole. And that's the problem. And that's where the problem lies. People don't want to fund it. People don't want to pursue this. But I think there's something here. And if you are a theoretical physicist or an engineer or somebody who is interested in the topic, I highly recommend that you start looking into this. So that was a bit of a sort of a rant from my side. And until next time when I come out with another podcast, have a good day and see you soon.